Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the meeting today. We shall start the meeting now. We will resume our discussion on point 1. May I kindly please remind the meeting that we have agreed to the following time limitations for interventions so that everybody receives a fair chance. For group statements, 5 minutes, and for statements by individual participants, 2 minutes. I now call on the employers group. Mr. Demester, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. I made it to Geneva, so good to be here in live presence with some of you. Yeah, to continue where we left off yesterday, I will just leave some brief comments on what was said yesterday, a couple of points that I would like to raise. And the first thing that is that I would like to, no matter how times you repeat it, you may think it becomes true, but it's actually not so. Urban public transport systems are not a public good. They are organized in public space, but they are not by definition a public good, because there are a lot of examples of such systems that are run, operated, controlled, and managed by others than public authorities. And what I would also like to highlight is that I believe that we share a common goal, and that is to go for efficient, sustainable, and comprehensive urban transport systems that are connected, that are complementary, that have sufficient coverage, that are inclusive.
Mr. Demester, if you would please allow me, there's a problem in the voice. They're just technically fixing it.
No,
because,
if you could ask if everyone can switch off their microphones, because there's some feedback.
Yeah. And everybody, please, if I can make a note, if everybody who's not speaking can switch off their mic, because there's a lot of disturbance in the background. Can I kindly ask you to do that? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
So I guess there was an echo and it's better now. So I start again. Yeah. So the first thing, starting off from where we left yesterday, there are a couple of points that I would like to raise. And the first is, no matter how many times you say it or repeat it, it doesn't make it become true. So public transport systems are not a public good. They are organized in public space, but that does not necessarily make them a public good. But because there are many examples of urban public transport systems that are managed, run, and operated by others than public authorities. Then second, I believe that we all share a common goal, and that is seeking for efficient, sustainable, and comprehensive urban public transport systems that are connected, that are complementary, that offer sufficient coverage, that are inclusive, that are safe. And that is independent of who is running them or organizing them. We do not believe that one is better than another. This is about the discussion, private or public organized. It doesn't matter as long as the systems are sustainable, safe, accountable, reliable, transparent, professionally organized, properly financed. That is what we aim for, and that is independent of who is organizing them. We don't want to go back to that 1980s discussion. We thought we had left that discussion behind. So we're aiming at discussing urban public transport systems, whether they are publicly or privately operated, whether they are publicly financed, privately financed, or a mix thereof. We aim for, as I said, sustainable and future-proof systems. Very short also about employment status, same discussion. This is not the place to discuss employment status. Diverse forms of employment each have their own value and place in the future of work, as we discussed in other fora. whether they are platform driven, whether it's in a traditional hierarchy situation or even autonomous peer-to-peer. We have to focus, as I said, on the quality and the sustainability. That is key, and that is what we need to discuss. That is what is needed, what action is needed to make for sustainable, future-proof urban transport systems. The urban transport public systems have been hard by the pandemic. The quantity, the number of drivers, the offer is reduced. The reputation is damaged, whether now that is with solid data underneath or not, but anyway, the reputation is damaged, and that should be our major concern to deal with that. I will leave it at that as a reply to what was discussed yesterday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. De Mester. Ms. Luna, the Vice Chairperson of the Government Group, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta, y buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por darme nuevamente la palabra sobre el punto de discusión número 1. Me parece que el día de ayer hubo algunas delegaciones del grupo gubernamental que no pudieron compartir sus puntos de vista. Me ceñiría a uno en concreto que fue mencionado esta mañana por el grupo, por una delegación del grupo de gobiernos, sobre la importancia de tener datos para el servicio público y sobre todo para la programación de transportes, que al momento este es un reto importante, el no contar con estos datos de manera pública y accesible a todos, hace difícil que se puedan programar los servicios de transporte público para atender a la demanda real de pasajeros. Y esto se vuelve más relevante en el contexto de la pandemia, ya que sigue habiendo aglomeraciones en ciertas rutas, en ciertas ciudades, que si existieran los datos a la disponibilidad de los proveedores de transporte público, sería mucho más sencillo poder suplir la demanda en ciertas zonas y así evitar la aglomeración de gente, e incluso esto tiene que ver y toca con lo relativo a la protección de la salud y seguridad en el trabajo de los propios conductores de los transportes públicos, y cómo los datos y los servicios de información podrían también cambiar incluso cómo los usuarios usan el transporte público. Ya existen algunos datos abiertos, pero no a consideración de algunas de las delegaciones del grupo de gobiernos, esto no es suficiente. Entonces es un tema que quedó pendiente de ayer, y me parece que otro que quedó pendiente del día de ayer como grupo de gobiernos es destacar, si bien lo destacaron de manera individual, pero como grupo de gobiernos destacar la importancia del entrenamiento y del reentrenamiento de los trabajadores, de los conductores del transporte público, para enfrentar como una de las medidas para enfrentar los cambios tecnológicos tan rápidos que hay ahora. Y creo que ahí me quedaría en el punto de discusión número 1. Creo que vamos a poder elaborar un poco más en el punto de discusión número 2 sobre estos temas que ya identificamos, y podría ser el caso, y aquí invito a los miembros del grupo de gobiernos si quisieran hacer algún comentario adicional sobre el punto de discusión número 1. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Ms. Luna. I think we have the representative of Philippines would like to speak from the government sector. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Sarah, as our representative, pointed out a lot of things that we discussed in the government group meetings. But the Philippines would also like to say that aside from the very many challenges that we mentioned, one of the perils of modernization, the shift to vehicles that are environment friendly, is the displacement of drivers from work in Southeast Asia, particularly. I'm familiar with this. I can't really say if this is the case with other countries. there are small industry players. They own the vehicles. With the modernization, their vehicles will go out of style. They will no longer be relevant, and that will displace them. So this is really a challenge. And at the same time, we do recognize that modernization is an opportunity to upgrade public utility vehicles for them to be compliant with standards that are friendly to persons with disabilities like me. So that's also an opportunity that we see. But we also see an opportunity in among our small industry players. Maybe this should be a call for them to organize themselves into cooperatives because they're very affected, the small industry players, or to organize into social solidarity enterprises. So that's also an opportunity that we see here. Although these opportunities may also face challenges. How do we make sure that this will happen? What assistance is needed for this to be pushed forward? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the representative of Philippines. Do we have any other government representatives that wish to take the floor? It seems we don't. Thank you all. We have now concluded our discussion on point 1. And we will be starting discussions on point 2. Mr. Wagner, could you please introduce the second point for discussion?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairperson. As you've all already again seen, these are in document TMD WTS stroke 2021 stroke 4. And the second point for discussion is what policies, measures, and practices have worked, what has not worked, and what needs to be done to address these decent work challenges and opportunities. And again, as you have seen, there's additional information attached to the points for discussion relative to this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. For this point of discussion, I will start with the workers group. Ms. Liam, you have the floor.
Chair, thank you very much. And I will, as we talked about challenges and difficulties in relationship to decent work yesterday, I will try in this intervention to focus on what has worked as more so than what has not worked. I just want to make a clarifying point that when we talk about public good, we are not talking about ownership or operation. We're using the definition, if I can read to you from the Oxford Dictionary, economic definition of public good, a commodity or service that is provided without profit to all members of society, either by government or by a private individual or organization. And of course, a definition of, or the concept of public good is used in the Sustainable Development Goals, and public transport, urban public transport is included. So this is where it's of course also used in the meeting report. So this is where our use of this term comes from. For discussion point 2, I would like to begin with a subject of gender discrimination and gender-based occupational segregation, which is one in which I think we have close agreement with our counterpart, the UITP, in the employers group. As I've mentioned, we've worked together on joint recommendation to strengthen women's employment in the sector. These recommendations include affirmative action policies, workplace training, gender responsive work environment and equipment, safe access to decent sanitation facilities, training on violence against women, mechanisms for investigation and redress, improvement of work-life balance and career opportunities, equal pay for work of equal value. And these efforts will be aided by gender impact assessments, consultation with women workers, and of course, ratification, implementation, and enforcement of Convention 190, along with implementation of Recommendation 206. Of course, gender, and I start there because this is a greatly important issue for our sector, which many of the governments also brought up yesterday. Of course, addressing gender inequality as a prerequisite requires also addressing unfair competition and the deterioration of standards. And I will now talk about several examples of policies and measures that have been effective in addressing these challenges. So, and my counterpart in the employers group now talked about the existence of both public and private operators and different forms of ownership and operation within the sector, which we fully acknowledge. We have brought to you not anecdotes, but a substantial amount of research that demonstrates that public ownership and operation brings potential advantages, including the possibility of cross-subsidizing, loss-making, and socially necessary services, access to less expensive finance, and the integration needed to run efficient, sustainable services with decent work conditions, which is central to what we're talking about. We have case studies and research compiled which demonstrate the improvement of services and condition through remunicipalization or insourcing, and believe that standards should be used to assess the appropriateness of contracting out based on quality service and conditions, and also the costs and benefits of insourcing. So the delegate representing the government of Brazil also has spoken about cases where there is contracting out to the private sector and the role that governments must play in intervening to achieve equal labor standards. And we are in full agreement here, and we'll point to the Labor Clauses Convention number 94 and Attendant Recommendation 84, which call for the removal of labor costs from competition among bidders in the tendering process to ensure that UPT contracts do not exert downward pressures on wages and working conditions. So this is essential to our sector. This means that labor and gender equality standards and chain of responsibility principles, which lay out responsibilities for each party in a contracting chain, are applied to tendering processes and reflected in service contracts. On the national scale, we can look at US Federal Transit Act Section 13C, which protects labor standards, conditions, and collective bargaining rights for all urban passenger transport projects with federal funding. This is irrespective of public and private. In Germany, the Tarifvertrag, didn't get it right. The TTGs, as much as I've practiced, guarantee transfer of undertakings in the case of a change in operators. So these are positive examples for us. In addition, the UN guiding principles, the ILO Tripartite Declaration, and the OECD guidelines provide guidance on due diligence, which can apply to the sector. Following the adoptions of the UN guiding principles, a number of states have adopted national action plans on business and human rights, which provide for human rights in procurement policies, public procurement policies. And of course, this should apply on the state and sub-state levels. In our sector, so we acknowledge that our sector is comprised of contracting chains. And these begin with local and sometimes national governments and extend to transport authorities, and then an operator, and sometimes subcontractors, several levels. Because of these chains, traditional concepts of government and social partners is inadequate to talk about protection of standards. So to specify the responsibilities of all levels in this chain, the meeting should refer to the ILO guidelines on the promotion of decent work and road safety in the transport sector, which outline responsibilities for transport buyers who are contracting entities and chain parties. And we've now been speaking about this quite a bit, that in many developing countries, UPT is defined by informal services. When we speak of inclusive informalization, which is very important to us, and I know to many of our counterparts in governments and employers, what we're talking about is the integration into public transport or mass transit through sustainable enterprises of services that are informal, such as 2- and 3-wheelers and services that, or minibuses, tuk-tuks, etc. So this transition, which is essential for responding to climate change and creating efficiency, is delayed by inadequate consultation with informal workers. And we're asking for inclusive processes for just transition and the creation of decent work. And I think we also see eye to eye with many governments and employers on this subject. Example brought just now by the delegate from the Philippines is the potential of workers' cooperative ownership to support modernization and service contracts for jeepneys in the Philippines. This would be in line with recommendation 193 on cooperatives and could be supported and implemented elsewhere. Separately, on the issue of non-standard forms of employment, which of course is very pertinent to this meeting and our discussions here. The CFA and Committee of Experts have regularly held that the full range of fundamental principles and rights at work, including the right to collective bargaining, are applicable to all workers, irrespective of employment status. Of course, this includes platform workers. The Centenary Declaration also makes clear that all workers should enjoy protections in accordance with the decent work agenda, including fundamental labor rights, living wage, maximum limits on working times in accordance with Convention 1, social protection and safety and health. And best practices in this area include facts-based employment relationship tests, especially those that begin with a presumption of employment status following recommendation 198. Safe and livable pay standards for ride-hailing drivers, for example, in Seattle and New York, which are based on cost recovery payment for all time worked, starting from log on. And this contributes to the control of supply, which contributes to road safety. And of course, collective agreements between workers and gig companies and those companies in places like Norway, Sweden, Italy, Denmark, the last being on a sectoral level. We do not deny that digitalization and AI can have benefits, we also must acknowledge that as they are used currently, they increase insecurity, work pressures, work privacy problems, and this leads to mental health issues, stress, road safety issues, and why we need collective bargaining and consultation with workers on the introduction of new technology and the use of data in particular, and again, brought up by the spokesperson for the government's group, the importance of regulating for government control and workers' rights to data collected from their work. And another important point I think that was brought up yesterday by several governments that, and also brought up in the meeting report, that particularly in the context of the pandemic, we see deteriorating debt sustainability in developing countries, and this puts a limit on fiscal space and the ability to invest in UPT. So this is a huge question, and I'm very happy that it's addressed in the ILC resolution on the crisis, which calls for global solidarity through support for developing countries. The workers group proposes the expansion of debt relief programs based on real debt cancellation and development assistance from international institutions that supports public investment and sustainable funding models for UPT. When we talk about sustainable funding models, we mean moving away from over-reliance on fare box revenues through substantial subsidies, national governments have a responsibility here, because while it's a cost, also UPT has great social benefits, including the reduction of emissions and creation of jobs. So this funding can be done through taxation, moving funds from excessive highway construction to UPT, and on the local level, earmarked property taxes, land value capture instruments, and congestion charging. And unions and workers have much to say and should be consulted with other stakeholders in developing sustainable funding models. As a basic starting point, which is where I started, governments must recognize urban passenger transport as a public good, per the definition earlier, a basic service per the definition in the report and from UN Habitat, and guarantee equitable access as a human right. Legislation to do this has been passed in France and Japan. We also see the Mexican government recently included the right to mobility under conditions of safety, accessibility, efficiency, sustainability, quality, inclusion, and equality in its constitution. We might also look to examples of other basic services such as water and waste, which have been designated human rights in Uruguay, Mexico, and the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Liam. Mr. Demester, for the employers group, you have the floor.
Thank you. So on question 2, what has worked, what hasn't? I will start with what we think, and I will rephrase it, what has worked and what is needed. And first, let it be clear that directly or indirectly, all the points that I will mention contribute or are even a precondition to achieve decent work outcomes. The first thing is about structural transformation of the urban transport sector towards green sustainability. Here we observe in the world, we observe already first movers, but a lot of countries, systems or regions are lagging behind. So this is something where we see that those who are already moving in that direction contribute significantly to better decent work outcomes. So those lagging behind should step up their efforts. In the short term, what is needed is also, and it's even an immediate priority, is to ensure that public and private transport operators can continue to undertake their activities, which have proven to be essential to other parts of the economy, to the healthcare sector, to the mobility of disadvantaged groups. This is, of course, linked to the still ongoing COVID crisis. And a first step there is the need for economic support measures following this crisis, because we think these support measures should continue as long as the pandemic continues to threaten the economic viability of transport operators. Second is financing funding. Guaranteeing a stable funding framework for urban transportation through dedicated mobility funds and other support measures are key. One of the next immediate priorities is, of course, to continue to ensure also safe and healthy urban transport services, including in the light of the emergence of new COVID-19 variants. And here also we have some good practice examples that should be followed, at least in the first place shared and then followed by others. But here an important side remark is that to ensure urban transportation continues to be safe, setting up clear rules and a coherent approach is necessary. And here social dialogue mechanisms should be used to ensure that social partners are involved and consulted in the elaboration of these sanitary measures, and more broadly the role social dialogue plays in mitigating the effects of the crisis and in finding possible solutions. Communication. Policymakers have a role to play in supporting communication efforts of the sector. Governments should step up their communication efforts to ensure their citizens listen to facts instead of perceptions, thus restoring public trust in urban transport systems. It is important to better understand the different country circumstances, as each country has a different level of development, and different urban to rural migration patterns and rates. One obvious solution is to foster inclusive, sustainable, and resilient urban transport systems, is to step up investments in urban transportation. Efficient urban transportation systems lie at the heart of sustainable cities and are essential to meet the challenges of urbanization for many reasons. Public transportation, for instance, is not only an efficient way of transportation, it also connects people to job opportunities, stimulates the economy, and has a strong social and economic return on investments. It comes as no surprise that the most competitive cities offer superior transportation infrastructure. Smart investments in urban transportation driven by innovation and service quality will create millions of local jobs worldwide with new expansion and renovation projects. It is estimated that investing in public transport could create 4.6 million jobs by 2030. All in all, smart and inclusive and sustainable urban transportation is a force for economic and social inclusion and positive environmental impacts. It's worth mentioning that the ILO resolution, a global call to action on COVID-19, adopted recently in June, constitutes a roadmap to building back better. It underlies the necessity of public and private investment in sectors hit hardest by the crisis, including the transport sector, to create inclusive economic growth and employment. However, for these investments to be successful, they should not only relate to increased access to quality infrastructure, but also include the need for innovative technologies and other approaches such as drones, artificial intelligence-based monitoring, autonomous and green vehicles, digital dashboards, etc. And here the role of the private sector in providing and contributing to public transportation should not be overlooked. Public policy decisions must be made to encourage and ease public and private sector collaboration. Success in the transport sector will require partnership, which relies on an enabling business environment. The 2007 International Labour Conference conclusions concerning the promotion of sustainable enterprises provide detailed guidance on what constitutes a conducive environment for sustainable enterprises, and also applies to public transportation systems. And it's clear that this calls for cooperation between governments and the private sector to align enterprise growth with sustainable development objectives and the creation of decent and productive employment. The employers group would certainly want the conclusions to include reference to this important document. Important lessons could also be drawn from the pandemic, where more fluid private-public partnerships have been concluded with the introduction of more agile and more flexible service delivery. For example, allowing flexing up or down the volume of services, temporary replacement of some routes with on-demand services, the introduction of more dynamic governance mechanisms to improve real-time decision-making. Next point is transition from informality to formality, and the significant possibilities that, for example, platform work offer in terms of transition to formality should be embraced, should not be overlooked, especially when we know that informal work accounts for up to 80% in certain cities. Lifting these workers, who are often vulnerable, stemming from a migrant background or people with disabilities, out of informal work should be a priority, and our group would certainly welcome language in the conclusion based on the ILO recommendation 202, which provides agreed guidance on how to achieve this, taking into account the specific needs and challenges for the urban transport sector. Next point, technological progress. As our economies are opening up again, it's critical that we harness the fullest potential of technological progress and digitalization, including, as I said, those innovations brought up by platform work to create decent jobs and sustainable enterprises. And this is called out in the ILO Centenary Declaration as well in the recent International Labour Conference Global Call to Action. And I quote, "Harness the fullest potential of technological progress and digitalization, including platform work, to create decent jobs and sustainable enterprises, enable broad social participation in its benefits, and address its risks and challenges, including by reducing the digital divide between people and countries. It is therefore essential that we address this as a priority. Smart urban planning, by combining them with smart public transit systems instead of opposing the two, focusing on connectivity, focusing on complementarity." Two more points to go. Attractiveness. This is about the discussion that we had on diversity. More inclusive towards women in the sector, and therefore we need to offer sufficient flexibility and safe and good working conditions. This is about making the job attractive, the sector attractive, and it links clearly with communication efforts to restore confidence. Skills and training. Linked to investments and new technologies, it is indispensable that we also increase public and private investment in skills development, lifelong learning, including decent apprenticeships, career guidance, upskilling and reskilling, and through active labor market policies and private and partnerships that facilitate successful labor market transitions and reduce skills mismatches, skills gaps, and skills shortages. Employers who are already confronted with shortages need future workforce to possess the necessary skills to master the new technological advancement. And as more and more urban transportation systems become more modern by using AI, machine learning, robotics, and technology, the sector's employers and workers must remain up to date with the latest human and social skills and technical skills. Social skills are equally important, such as critical thinking, spatial urban structured designs, mastery of geographic information systems, communication skills, and many other are critical as more cities will embrace the future and aim towards a more cleaner and a more energy efficient environment. Research is also one of the elements that is indispensable for the future of these sectors. For this sector, for example, on what I just mentioned, the skills needs, but also to collect and dig into good practice examples, because as I said, we have many urban or many cities or urban environments that are running ahead of the pack that already embraced a more sustainable business or public model. What does not work? Because that was also part of the discussion under this point too. What certainly does not work is aiming only for public and not private organized and or operated urban transport systems, ignoring the potential of contracting and subcontracting certainly does also not work, because this offers possibility to operate with more specialized and more targeted operators. What also doesn't work is the absence of a relationship with all actors involved. Unilateral decisions, unilateral strategies, unilateral planning by governments without consulting and aiming at shared ownership with all actors involved is certainly something we should not continue to do. Unclear expectations, unclear procurement tenders that focus on cost only without taking into account the desired quality of the service defined is also clearly something that we should not continue to use. Or even another example is when tendering is without cost attribution or a cost attribution that is not sufficient to reach the desired quality level. The absence of competence and or experience with procurement, insufficient knowledge about defining quality and service levels, something we should not continue or let exist in the future. Insufficient maintenance, outdated old school maintenance practices, not embracing more modern approaches to maintenance, such as predictive or preventive maintenance, is also we should ban from the future. Also, something that doesn't work is reference to Convention 94, labor clauses in public contracts convention. Why? Simply because this convention is not supported by the employers. And then also something that does not work or only works to a certain limited extent is aiming at cooperatives or a collaborative economy concepts approach. Why? Because there is sufficient evidence that these models tend to slow down or run behind embracing technological innovation, and thus not harnessing the potential of using this technology at the benefit of workers, users and employers, and thus creating more decent working conditions. That was our go through question number 3, what we should do and what we should not embrace in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Demister. Ms. Luna, the Vice Chairperson of the Government Group, you have the floor. But sorry, before do we have any interventions from the employers? Any? None at all. Okay, sorry about that. You can go ahead. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Sobre el punto de discusión número 2, puedo informar a la sesión plenaria que hubo una discusión muy rica entre los miembros gubernamentales, con experiencias muy concretas sobre aquellas medidas que han funcionado, y también los gobiernos identificamos aquellas que tal vez no. Entonces, en algunos momentos de mi intervención me referiré a buenas prácticas de parte de ciertos países que compartieron sus experiencias al momento en el sector en general y con respecto a la respuesta a la pandemia. Uno de los temas principales, y creo que ya lo mencionamos anteriormente el día de ayer, son cómo abordar los cambios tecnológicos y las medidas de apoyo para la transición del sector del transporte hacia el futuro, y la necesidad de formular políticas. Es algo que me parece que ha surgido de parte del grupo de gobiernos, pero también lo he escuchado de parte de los mandantes sociales. Todas las subvenciones y los apoyos económicos para abordar las deficiencias en la infraestructura y en los sistemas. Hay gobiernos que compartieron, que han emprendido medidas para mejorar el transporte de su país en cuestiones de infraestructura y la financiación para diferente tipo de licencias. Otro tema importante me parece que ha sido la accesibilidad. Y están las dos vertientes, la accesibilidad en cuanto a la infraestructura, como ya mencioné antes, sobre todo para personas con una discapacidad, desde rampas, personas con movilidad restringida, salas de espera y otras infraestructuras, pero también es accesibilidad con perspectiva de género para las trabajadoras en el sector, con espacios especiales para cuando cambian de turno y demás, que la infraestructura misma tenga esta perspectiva de género. Otro tema importante que ya lo mencioné en el punto de discusión número 1, pero ahora se elabora un poco más, es la formación de los trabajadores en este medio, sobre todo para aquellos ligado con la accesibilidad, sobre todo para aquellos usuarios que tienen ciertas discapacidades y que los trabajadores tengan entrenamiento y profesionalización para prestar ese tipo de servicios a la sociedad. Con respecto a la pandemia en concreto, hubo obvias limitaciones a las actividades públicas y en ese sentido varias prácticas que mencionaré tal vez más adelante. Y otro énfasis importante es en la seguridad y salud en el trabajo. Como países como Indonesia han priorizado que los trabajadores en el sector del transporte público urbano reciban vacunas de manera prioritaria y que haya tests de forma regular, y que se asegure en la medida de lo posible un entorno seguro para los trabajadores, así como para los usuarios del transporte público. Otro tema importante compartido por el gobierno de Filipinas, por ejemplo, que yo espero que tal vez mis colegas participando puedan elaborar un poco más, pero es importante llamar la atención que una solución que ha encontrado ese gobierno ha sido el promover las economías solidarias o las cooperativas, sobre todo para aquellos trabajadores en el sector informal que puedan tener acceso a cierta protección a través de esta modalidad y como una forma de adaptarse a los cambios rápidos por la tecnología en este sector. Obviamente esto viene ligado también con un esfuerzo por formalización de los actores y los operadores y el reconocimiento de que la formalización es esencial para atender los retos que se han identificado. Un tema importante que creo que también lo mencionó el grupo empleador y el grupo trabajadores, que el reconocimiento de que los esquemas varían mucho dependiendo al país y a las regiones sobre el transporte público privado o no, sobre cómo se provee el transporte y el servicio, y que la privatización en muchos sentidos es inevitable y que, como bien lo menciona el informe que nos ayuda para las discusiones del día de hoy, ni una ni otra forma aseguran o no la eficacia y eficiencia del servicio o la protección de derechos. Así que en ese sentido, un llamado de los gobiernos es a mantener esta cuestión de manera flexible, ya que lo importante en este sentido sería asegurar la regulación, para que cualquiera que sea la forma en la que se proveen los servicios, ya sea de manera con recursos públicos, privados o con alianzas público-privadas, la regularización esté en el centro y asegure que sin importar cuál sea la modalidad, tengamos servicios de transporte eficientes y protección de los derechos de los trabajadores. Entonces, la regulación es una parte fundamental desde la perspectiva de los gobiernos. Un tema importante que varios gobiernos mencionaron es la contratación pública, el procurement, como lo mencionó el vocero del grupo de los empleadores hace un momento. Me parece que la posición de los gobiernos coincide mucho en decir que hay una necesidad importante de tener estándares para la contratación y adquisición de los bienes materiales. Y, por ejemplo, se dio el caso particular del marco europeo común en el que se regula la contratación pública y se crean estrategias niveladas e igualitarias para el transporte en toda Europa. Entonces, creo que la experiencia de la Unión Europea, y si hay delegaciones de la Unión Europea que quieran ahondar más en este tema, es sin duda uno muy importante, porque esto asegura la transparencia, y no solo la transparencia, sino también la equidad en competencia y otros temas importantes que ayudan en que el servicio sea eficiente y sea de alta calidad. Por otra parte, programas concretos, por ejemplo, una delegación mencionó que tienen un programa que durante la pandemia aquellos trabajadores del sector de la economía de plataformas que se quedaron sin empleo fueron contratados en el servicio público de transporte y se les fue pagado su salario con base en los kilómetros avanzados, digamos, o trabajados, y esto como una medida para que no perdieran su fuente de ingresos en su totalidad. Algunas otras delegaciones subrayaron la importancia, como ya lo mencioné, de las alianzas público-privadas y casos muy concretos en los que la movilidad se ha convertido en parte del llamado de los usuarios, en este caso a la justicia social, y cómo a través del transporte público urbano se tiene acceso a todos los derechos y cómo es importante avanzar en servicios de buena calidad en estas con base o con la ayuda de estas alianzas público-privadas. Dos políticas concretas que creo que son importantes mencionar es la consolidación de la legislación para abordar los problemas de contratación pública, que ya lo mencionamos. Es interesante aquí decir que no solamente fue el caso o el gran ejemplo del marco europeo común, sino también de países de Latinoamérica que tienen como prioridad este tema de la contratación pública. El tema de la regulación surgió también, como ya lo mencioné. Ahora también algunos ejemplos de las cosas que algunas delegaciones consideraron que no han funcionado, que también está en esta parte de la discusión. De nuevo, tiene que ver con lo anterior, la falta de regulación. Muchas veces algunas autoridades, interlocutores sociales, donde hay mucha informalidad, han fracasado en enfrentar los desafíos que hemos identificado y no se ha sabido formalizar ni remediar las vulnerabilidades de los trabajadores. Un tema muy concreto que también surgió en nuestras discusiones es la incapacidad o la falta de capacidad que experimentamos muchos países justo en eso, en identificar cuáles son las vulnerabilidades de los trabajadores, sobre todo en las formas no convencionales de trabajo y las economías de plataformas, y cómo es importante identificar esas vulnerabilidades para poder identificar cuáles son las políticas concretas que necesitamos para proteger las prerrogativas y los derechos laborales de los trabajadores. Ya hablé de la recopilación de información, es importante y lo enfatizamos aquí. Y una parte muy importante es la inspección laboral y las políticas de implementación, que tiene que ver también con la regulación, y la falta de inversión en inspección laboral lleva a que las autoridades no puedan actuar y que solo puedan reaccionar, e incluso hay una propuesta de hablar de un cuerpo de inspectores laborales, obviamente enfatizados en este sector, que puedan actuar antes de que los problemas estén ahí, y eso es algo importante para que la autoridad sea más proactiva. Otro caso interesante fue el caso que compartió la delegación, por ejemplo, de Portugal, donde compartieron que durante la pandemia financiaron medidas especiales para, por ejemplo, la limpieza del transporte, la adecuación de los transportes privados y públicos para la protección de los conductores y evitar contagios, y que todo esto fue una medida que vino del gobierno mismo para apoyar al sector de transporte durante la pandemia. Y también otro caso interesante de buenas prácticas es la inversión para una promoción del transporte público urbano, y que la gente después de la pandemia, los usuarios, vuelvan a tener confianza en tomar estos servicios, ya que existen todavía obviamente reticencias para usar estos transportes públicos. Y también la adaptación de nuevo a las nuevas tecnologías y la manera en que se ha reglamentado las economías de plataformas y los servicios de demanda, que tanto se ha hablado en esta reunión, y cómo algunos países han reglamentado este tipo de servicios a través el otorgamiento de licencias y el registro de los vehículos. Y finalmente, disculpen si me extendí un poco, pero como pueden ver, esto ha sido una discusión muy amplia y muy rica, y de nuevo invitaría a las delegaciones a que expandan sus buenas prácticas en esta discusión. Pero bueno, sin duda la transición a la formalidad debe tener como objetivo reducir el déficit de trabajo decente y brindar niveles adecuados de seguridad social. La seguridad social sigue siendo uno de los temas recurrentes en esta discusión. como lo mencioné, el marco legal e institucional sólidos, con inspección, con regulación y con políticas de protección. La formación, mejora de capacidades, profesionalización para promover eficazmente la transición a la formalidad y permitir que los trabajadores se actualicen a los cambios tecnológicos, fortalecer instituciones, mecanismos, infraestructura, siempre, y creo que aquí es muy importante destacarlo en caso de que no lo haya hecho, pero el tema del diálogo social ha sido fundamental en todas estas medidas que hemos identificado como grupo de gobiernos. Las inversiones sostenibles, ya lo comenté, las prácticas de adquisiciones responsables y las brechas de gobernanza nos parece que es un tema que hay que seguir abordando, y las medidas obviamente para mitigar los desafíos de seguridad y salud en el trabajo, y cómo estas medidas, creo que ha sido algo que se ha mencionado por todos, debe de ser a través del diálogo social. Y hay otros muchos comentarios, pero me detengo aquí en aras del tiempo, y de nuevo invito a las delegaciones del grupo gubernamental en caso de que quieran tomar la palabra para ahondar en otros de estos temas. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Ms. Luna. Do we have any governments that would like to take the floor? We have the representative of the government of Iraq. You have the floor.
طاب مساءكم. إني بشرى عبد الرضا ممثلة وزارة العمل.
Yes, Ms. Bushra, please continue.
طاب مساءكم. إني بشرى عبد الرضا ممثلة وزارة العمل.
Ay, mami, pues yo convivo con él y todo, yo sé cómo es.
يسرني أن أشارك حضرتكم في هذا الاجتماع، ويسعدني أن أمثل دولة العراق في العمل اللائق والمستدام لخدمة النقل الحضري. سوف أتحدث عن البيانات والتكنولوجيا ودورها في النقل الحضري. لا ينبغي أن تكون غاية الحكومات هي تكديس أكبر عدد من البيانات، بل الأحرى تحويل هذه البيانات إلى معلومات وإلى رؤى، وبالتالي هذا يساعد في توجيه عملية التخطيط، وعملية التخطيط عملية مهمة، ووضع السياسات الصحيحة، وكل هذا يحتاج إلى الوقت والالتزام الحقيقي من الحكومات والقطاع الخاص، وهذه نقطة مهمة جداً. فالدمج المستدام للتكنولوجيا في عملية تخطيط القطاع يحتاج إلى الكثير من الوقت وإلى قيادة قوية وموارد مناسبة متوفرة، أي توفر الموارد لتطوير هذا القطاع ونجاح هذا النشاط، وهذه أيضا تعتبر من التحديات ومشكلة. وأيضا تحتاج لتحقيق هذه النشاطات إنشاء وحدات متخصصة داخل وزارة النقل تجمع بين أشخاص ذوي مؤهلات وخبرات شتى، لكنهم يشتركون في أنهم جميعا مهتمون باستخدام وتحليل البيانات لتحسين عملية التخطيط، وأيضا ممكن المساعدة في تدريب ذوي مهن النقل، هيئات القطاع الخاص ممكن الاستعانة بهم في بعض القطاعات، ونستخدم هذه البيانات وجمعها تساعدنا حاليا في تقييم نظام الأجرة المتكامل وإيجاد حلول حقيقية لهذا القطاع. تقييم فوائد شبكات سكك الحديد. سكك الحديد هي من الوسائل المهمة خصوصا في العراق، تربط بين محافظات البلد مع بعض، وتعتبر وسيلة مهمة ليس فقط لنقل الأشخاص بل والسلع، وهذا من القطاعات المهمة. أيضا التحليل الدقيق للبيانات والمتطورة دورا رئيسيا في ترجمتها إلى نتائج أفضل. من المشاكل اللي نعاني منها حاليا مثلا ظهرت لدينا فئة جديدة في مجال النقل، ظهور فئة العمال بعمر دون 18 سنة حاليا بسبب ظروف كورونا، بسبب الوضع البيئي، بسبب الوضع الاقتصادي في البلد، تردي الأوضاع، مما أدى أيضا إلى إدخال وسائل نقل جديدة صغيرة، وهذا يزيد الكثير، زاد لدينا الكثير من الحوادث. وبالتالي هنا يظهر دور السياسات في التدخل لدراسة وتنظيم هذا القطاع الذي يعتبر فئة غير منظمة، خصوصا في المناطق النائية أو الريفية في العراق كما نسميها. أيضا تأثير فيروس كورونا أدى إلى تراجع القطاع بشكل كبير، انخفاض الإيرادات، نقص عدد الرحلات، أجور العاملين، بدأت أجور العاملين تقل أو زيادة ساعاتهم مقابل أجور ضئيلة. هذا أيضا سبب فد مشكلة لعدم وجود فرق تفتيشية، لعدم توفر أو قلة القوانين أو تطبيق القوانين في العراق، عدم وجود لجان من القطاع العام تشرف على القطاع الخاص، وضع اللوائح أو القوانين، تحسين المهارات لخدمة هذا القطاع، خصوصا إحنا في العراق حاليا نعاني من سياسات تجارية مفتوحة تخلو من ضوابط الاستيراد، تتمخض منها زيادة أعداد السيارات، أي ممكن استيراد العديد من السيارات أكثر من حاجتنا لها وبأي نوع، وحتى موديل السيارة، وهذا أيضا أدى إلى الزخم في الشوارع، أدى إلى كثرة الحوادث. هناك مشاكل حقيقية لدينا وحلولها تكاد تكون شبه معلومة. شكرا جزيلا. شكرا.
Thank you to the representative of the government of Iraq. Before we go on to the next speaker, I kindly ask everybody who's not a speaker to mute their microphones so everybody can hear clearly the speakers. Thank you. Do we have any other representatives from any governments? Okay. I will now give a second round of interventions to the group so that they may make brief comments to the statements we have heard during our discussions. Mr. Demester, any final response from the employers?
Thank you. We heard some during this round. We heard some very interesting comments or references made by different speakers. I'm not going to add anything from my side. I take away something that I also said: the importance of underpinning actions and doing further research, collecting data and statistics on the different subtopics related, whether that now is related to skills, whether it's related to the use of new technology, health and safety monitoring. I take that away as something that is needed to underpin whatever action we decide to jointly put forward. That is certainly a point that is elementary to underpin our proposals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Demester. Ms. Liam, do you have any response from the workers?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Chairperson. I want to make a few comments in response to the employers. I also have two delegates who have interventions, 2 minutes each. Can I take them in order? So to start, we can express our support for need for training, skills training and upskilling in the case of digitalization. We want, and again, I'll reiterate that we are not against technological innovation per se, but we are concerned about mitigating adverse effects, for example, in the area of AI-based predictive maintenance, which can have cost and adverse health and safety effects. And again, reiterate our the need for preventative maintenance, but more generally on the introduction of technology and digitalization. There are several ILO standards, including recommendation 169 on employment policy, which explicitly call for members to encourage employers and workers organizations to enter into collective agreements that look at the consequences of new technology, to echo and agree with the governments on the need for government control of and access to data, and for workers to have access to data, data that is collected through their activities and regulation in this area. This is, of course, also highlighted in the ILO's flagship report on the platform economy. Very last point, Convention 94 was brought up. I just want to point out this is a up-to-date and well-ratified convention. It is also one of the instruments that is mentioned in the conclusions concerning the promotion of sustainable enterprises, which we all agree are important, from the ILC in June 2007. Those conventions include the Labor Clauses Convention 1940, number 94, as well as Workers' Representation Convention 135, Convention 183, the Labor Inspection Convention number 81, and I will use that moment to reflect our agreement with the government about the importance of investment, well-resourced inspections, labor inspection facilities that work together with road inspection, for example, and on chain of responsibility principles. And also in the conclusions on sustainable enterprises from 2007, of course, the employment relations recommendation 198 is referenced. So when we talk about sustainable enterprises, we are of course talking about the relevance of all of these instruments. Thank you. And I will go to John Mark, the workers delegate from Uganda, who will speak on the question of inclusive formalization.
Thank you, Walson, of spokesperson for the workers and vice chair, and thank you, Madam Chair. I want to take a moment and just speak about the importance of integrating two-wheelers, three-wheelers, taxi minibuses into the formal public transport services. Madam Chair, the success of large infrastructure projects depend largely on engagement and support of the workers affected. Major projects frequently fail due to lack of consultation or negotiation with those whose livelihood depend on this industry. The World Bank recognizes consensus building is very critical in introducing infrastructure projects. Our proposal for an inclusive approach to transition requires that transport regulators and planning authorities build a positive relationship with trade unions, cooperatives, and associations that represent informal transport sector. We propose certain few basic steps, Madam Chair. One is that planning authorities have to improve their knowledge of the informal passenger public transport in their cities. Here we're looking at the market structures, business model, employment and ownership relationships, as well as basic data on the size and composition of the workforce. Secondly, Madam Chair, we need to look at conducting labor impact assessments to evaluate three key things. One, the potential effects of projects on the number of people whose livelihoods will suffer or will worsen. Two, potential initiatives to mitigate against losses of jobs. And three, potential pathways for formal employment that can lead to high quality jobs. Thirdly, Madam, is the issue of permanent structures, tripartite structures and procedures for engagement that should provide the basic elements for genuine dialogue, mutual understanding between the authorities and the informal public transport passenger industry players. Lastly, there is need for the strengthening of the weak and often divided organization and representation capacity of the workers, employers, and owners in the informal transport industry. Madam Chairperson, the ILO has an important role here in assisting the capacity building or capacity development of both employers and workers organizations for a democratic and representative organization, and ensuring respect for fundamental rights in the freedom of association and collective bargaining, thereby increasing representative issues of the informal transport sector. I thank you, Madam Speaker, Madam Chairperson, and delegates.
Thank you very much for your intervention. I believe we have one more speaker from the workers, Ms. Liam.
Yes, thank you. The next speaker will be John Lyons, the representative from the United States, online.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity. So as unions continue to struggle against the poor model of privatized public transport, we can already see the positive results of decisions to remunicipalize the services and or impose stronger conditions on private actors in the urban passenger transport contracting chain. One of the examples I'd like to offer today comes from Cincinnati, Ohio, where ATU Local 627 had grown increasingly frustrated with the city's private operator due to consistently poor wages, untenable working conditions, and inefficient services. These issues were leading to high turnover rates, a lack of morale, and a stressful working environment. The local, working with the international body, was able to show that the service could be run more effectively and efficiently if the Public Transit Authority was to directly operate those services. Subsequently, the private contract was terminated on January 1st of 2020, and those services are now run in-house. Another example shows how public authorities can drive up standards by imposing stronger regulation on the private sector. The ATU and the Transportation Learning Center have developed a set of procurement standards for public authorities to use when acquiring new zero-emission buses. The language provides for training and education of the existing workforce in all aspects of operating and maintaining these vehicles, as well as the infrastructure to charge them. We're also working to establish apprenticeship programs in both the US and Canada to train the next generation. This will help ensure that decent jobs in urban passenger transport are available for years and decades to come. Madam Chair, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your intervention. We now go to the Ms. Luna. Any further comments from your side?
Gracias, señora presidenta. Por el momento, como vocera del grupo de gobiernos, no tengo ningún comentario adicional a los que ya hice, pero de nuevamente invito a colegas de otras delegaciones en caso de que quieran tomar la palabra. Gracias.
Thank you, Ms. Luna. We have the representative of Brazil. He would like to take the floor. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you once more for the opportunity. Our vice chairperson has mentioned pretty much everything that we have discussed in our earlier session, but I would just like to emphasize and stress a few points. Start bringing back the concerns on the operation of the system directly by governments and authorities or not, or the privatization option. So it has been just this issue has been just been mentioned by the American representative of the workers, and I understand perfectly his concerns. And I'd like to say that I strongly support his remarks when he said something that we have mentioned yesterday as well, related to the strengthening of the regulations on the sector. I would like to mention here one article of our constitution, of the Brazilian constitution, article number 30, when it talks about what is the attribution, what is the competence of the municipalities in our country. And it considers urban transport as an essential service, as a public service, and an essential one. And it gives the option to the municipalities to organize and execute directly the service, or to subcontract and privatize the system. So it's an option that is offered to our municipality. So for us here, that is our reality. It is an option. The government, the authorities, local authorities can choose which one they think is the better option. And we can say that it's not a definitive one. As the American representative says in Cincinnati, Ohio, the municipality took back the execution of the service because it was not properly being operated. So it's also an option. Local administrations can end the contract if it's not being correctly fulfilled, and take back the operation. So it's also an option. So what we would like to emphasize is that whether local authorities choose to operate themselves the system or not, it is very important that there is adequate legislation in place, enacted previously, that set the conditions of the subcontracting, of the outsourcing or so on, to set the conditions of procurement as well, and also establishes what are the key aspects that should be respected in the specific contract that is going to be established between the local authority and the private operator. So just to emphasize once again what we have mentioned yesterday. And of course, these contracts and this legislation must stress and emphasize respect to labor provisions and local labor provisions and labor legislations, guaranteeing that there will be social collective bargaining, access to collective bargaining, giving access to the unions to negotiate the terms of the delivery of the service, and so on. So those are prerequisites that must be fulfilled. Sorry. And once more, we would like to also mention aspects related to labor inspection. And here I'm advocating this because I am a member of the Brazilian labor inspection system. So it's something very dear to me. We have great concerns about that. We understand that it's something that's very important and plays a key role in preventing all those problems that we are discussing here, informality and etc., to occur. So we understand that labor inspection systems and enforcement policies, in many cases, noticeably in places where the situation regarding decrease in labor standards and widespread of informality went out of control, they may not have been strong. These policies on labor inspection and enforcement, they may have not been strong and efficient as they should. Lack of investment in labor inspection and enforcement intelligence makes authorities merely reacting actors. They only react to complaints and the problems that is brought to them, when they should do exactly the opposite, acting in a proactive way to prevent circumvention of legal regulations. So we suggest that special groups of inspection and enforcement could be created with increased expertise in the sector in order to better address all violations frequently associated. And also, we would like to mention the intervention of the representative from Uganda that talked about two and three wheelers, two and three wheel vehicles that are used in urban passenger transport. Many places in the world is the case here in Brazil, especially two wheels, motorcycles. We understand that authorities must somehow include all concerns related to these workers in the regulations and the managing of the system, the UPT service system as a whole. Not either considering them one share of the public transport or not, they must be, their issues and their interests must be addressed properly. That would be all for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you to the representative of the government of Brazil. Do we have any other representatives that would wish to speak? Yeah. I think the employers have a comment. Please, Mr. De Mister.
Yes, thank you. Just very short, and probably not a lot of people in the room or in the digital environment are familiar with some of the references to conventions that were used. But I would like to come back briefly on Convention 94. Just to say, I already said we do not support it. So for the sake of this meeting where we see common ground and consensus, this is a dead-end street, but just factual. On the 60 countries that have ratified it, only 1/4 of them is really applying this convention. And during the last general discussion on this instrument, countries raised numerous comments, outdated, in contradiction with EU rules, too costly application, overly bureaucratic, or national labor legislation provided adequate protection. As a result, many of the ratifying countries do not even send reports anymore to the CEACR. So it's not relevant for this discussion. The same goes with the discussion on whether we should focus solely on publicly organized and managed urban transport systems. This is, as I said, was a 1980s discussion. We're not going to go there again. If that was the real solution, we would not be sitting here discussing the lack of diversity, the lack of safety, the lack of health, the problems with maintenance, the problems with infrastructure, let alone the long list of mismanagement, financial mismanagement, or even corruption in publicly organized transport systems. So let's not go there, and let's seek common ground. As I said, let's seek a future, a sustainable future for a performant, efficient urban public transport systems, including decent job conditions for all. Thank you.
Ms. Liam, you have an intervention?
Thank you. I'm glad that that the employer's spokesperson has brought up the fairly large number of ratifications of Convention 94, and also the fact that the ILO supervisory mechanisms have identified that there's area for improvement in the area of enforcement. And so I state once again, I think that with an up-to-date convention, it's not possible to simply dismiss it, and we would support stronger enforcement of this convention, which is relevant to the discussion and the agreement we have reached about the importance of social standards in the process of tendering and contracting. In the area of publicly owned transport systems, I don't think that we've had any substantive evidence or discussion on mismanagement or problems with maintenance in publicly owned, either public transport authorities or publicly owned and operated operating companies here yet. But I think what the discussion points to is, and we did from the worker side try to bring in quite a bit of research and data about where we've seen those problems in the private sector, and we've seen them improved through insourcing and public operation. Nonetheless, I think what the discussion points to is that this discussion within the ILO is quite out of date. The document, the research that's referenced in the report, the meeting report, is from 2001 and raises some of these issues, but it does not bring us up, through the last 20 years. And so maybe there is agreement here that we need, we're in a different moment from 1980. And if we went down that road, then we would be going back in time. So we need research and data collection that will help us move this discussion forward within the context of post-pandemic world, within the context of now past to substantial economic crises, financial crises, and again with a whole host of cases of remunicipalization and insourcing that we can draw from to learn lessons, whether they say to us, this is positive or negative. So maybe there's some common ground on what work the ILO can take forward.
Thank you, Ms. Leah. Thank you, everybody. We will present the video that yesterday we had a technical problem with the sound. Then we will take a 5-minute break and continue to proceed with point number 3. So basically, we have concluded our discussions with point number 2. Okay.
Hello, everyone. I hope you are doing well. My name is Mohamed Mezgani, and I am the Secretary General of UITP, the International Association of Public Transport. It's an absolute honor to have been invited to address you today. Let me start by introducing you to UITP. UITP is a passionate champion of sustainable urban mobility. It is the only worldwide network to bring together and all sustainable transport modes. We have been doing so for the past 136 years. With our multitude of activities related to advocacy, knowledge creation, and networking, at UITP we ensure that we are the point of reference for everything related to the public and sustainable urban transport sector. Approximately 18 months ago, along with the rest of the world, our sector went through a major disruption due to the onset of the pandemic. We immediately kicked into high gear and set out to be the lighthouse for the sector. It was obvious that the sector's priority had changed, but what were these new priorities? How could we help the public transport sector tide over this difficult period? Working closely with our members, we redefined our work program to address the revised direction our sector is headed in. We have identified 4 main priorities for the sector. And these are: first, building resilient urban and public transport that can withstand future cities. Second, providing decarbonized and low emissions mobility by adding the shift to public transport and the development of active travel, so cities and countries can achieve their climate objectives. Third, advancing systems and services for better urban mobility and providing operational and technological solutions. And fourth, redefining public transport to support the provision of greater range of mobility alternatives to the private car, and positively impacting the urban landscape. We know that public transport is a healthy, sustainable way of life for all. So we have categorized these new priorities under the umbrella theme called Mobility for Life. While some of these are the result of the pandemic, others are ongoing priorities that now have more importance than ever before. The program is completed by 3 horizontal dimensions which highlight trends and challenges that are relevant to virtually all major developments in the sector, such as people-centered mobility. This in particular will allow to steer activities towards a more customer-centric public transport and mobility system, but also putting the workforce at the center of many initiatives. Or digital transformation, which is an ongoing process relevant for many, if not all, the initiatives. And financial sustainability. It's a common challenge for our sector, which is being redefined by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. When you go into the details of all these priorities, you will see that they all have a strong people dimension. And when we talk about people, of course, this includes our customers, but it also puts the spotlight on our workers. At UITP, we call public transport staff the guardians of mobility, especially considering their essential role in keeping cities moving during the pandemic and the lockdowns. Staff and trade unions have a crucial role to play in helping to shape the new priorities and making them happen. In that context, appropriate structures in which a dialogue between management and labor can take place are essential. Knowing this, since many years, UITP is actively engaged in the social dialogue, both at European and worldwide level. Our strategic direction means we are inherently aligned with many of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In particular, we see synergies and opportunities for further support in relation to SDG 8, SDG 11 and SDG 13 through cooperation and common purpose with the representatives of workers and other key stakeholders. UITP believes that social dialogue is a fundamental component of sustainable development. We are proud that over the last number of years, we have developed a close working relationship with the ITF and ETF through the establishment of a Memorandum of Understanding in 2013. This has led to a common position in relation to gender issues, supporting SDG 5, as well as other key joint positions in respect of decent work, safe workplaces, and climate change. It's our belief that through social dialogue and cooperation with partners in local and national government, the urban public transport sector will be able to help deliver economic growth. And this can in turn foster and sustain decent work well into the future. I would like to commend all those who have taken the initiative to establish this technical meeting on the future of decent work in the urban passenger transport sector, and wish all the participants every success in their deliberations this week. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you all. We'll have a 5-minute break and then we will resume with point of discussion number 3. Thank you. إلا إن هاي قالت قال تاخذ لكم الموعد. Terminal 2 في المطار. Shall we start the meetings, please? We will now start the discussion on point 3. Mr. Wagner, could you please introduce the third point for discussion?
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Yes, the third point for discussion, again, in the document with the points for discussion, TMDWTS/2021/4 is as follows. Taking into account the great diversity in different countries and cities in the organization of urban passenger transport, what recommendations can be made for future action by the International Labor Organization and its members, and this includes governments, employers, and workers' organizations, regarding the promotion of decent and sustainable work in urban passenger transport operations and services? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. For this point of discussion, I will start with the employers group. Mr. Demester, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. So on this point, what should governments, social partners, and the ILO do? I will start by making a couple of recommendations to governments, which of course have a key role in tackling mobility issues. The first is the need to support financially transport operators to address their short-term liquidity needs, obviously arising from the COVID crisis. The need to restore public trust through communication activities on the health and safety measures taken by urban operators. And linked to that, the necessity to involve social partners when adopting new safety and health recommendations linked to COVID-19. Governments need also to tackle as a matter of priority the deficiencies of public urban transport. As we have been highlighting during the last 2 days, this particular subsector requires massive investment in physical and digital infrastructure, in equipment, in connectivity, and in sustainable urban planning in almost all regions of the world. These investments are indispensable as an efficient system of urban mobility can help create greater economic opportunities, can increase productivity and promote the overall economic health of communities. Linked to these investment needs, it's urgent that governments step up their efforts to address the skills mismatch, which will only become more acute with the implementation of new mobility technologies. Without, of course, a skilled workforce in this sector, it will be difficult to implement any aspirations that we have for the sector. For this to happen, on both elements, investment, skills, government should take advantage of the help and the knowledge of the private sector, which is a key ally in building back the cities of the future. Governments need to adopt policies which facilitate and attract private investments in urban infrastructure. Next element, creating an enabling environment for businesses which encourages entrepreneurship and innovation. The role, of course, of governments doesn't stop at the points that I mentioned before, but they also have responsibility in creating an enabling environment for businesses. New technologies such as autonomous and electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, urban planning, and other innovation can only be integrated if there is a sound and predictable environment for innovation. Governments should therefore take an active stand to promote new technologies as they provide many benefits to our societies and workers. As we have seen, the private sector is key to provide for a broad-based, job-rich recovery with decent work opportunities for all in the urban transport sector. The emergence of new business models is an illustration of that. These new business models, which complement and enrich public transportation systems, require cooperation, collaboration at systemic levels so that they can address all mobility challenges. Governments also need to leverage the decent work opportunities the digital era offers to urban transportation by granting access to all to digital technologies. This can be done by hindering fair competition, by avoiding hindering innovation, whilst at the same time tackling some of the challenges such as the digital divide, which prevents many from benefiting from the new opportunities. Smart regulation and flexibility in that regard is essential. The pandemic has shown that urban mobility patterns are changing quickly, forcing urban mobility players to understand and respond agile to the changing expectations and behaviors of their customers. An enabling business environment for innovation, productivity growth, and sustainable enterprises is key in that regard to allow the sector to continue to offer employment opportunities, to offer decent work, and to leverage technologies. Policymakers thus need to recognize that productive employment is strongly linked to the creation of decent work as a vehicle to build back better. As we've mentioned it, leveraging these new technologies appears to be also key to curb the spread of informality and accelerate the transition to the formal economy. Governments should also develop measures to increase the resilience of urban transport to future potential crises, support mobility strategies presented as part of the national recovery and resilience plans, since they contribute and accelerate the shift to clean, sustainable, and shared mobility. Governments, as well as workers and employers' organizations, should also step up their efforts to promote gender equality by empowering women as both providers and users of urban transportation. Now I turn to the ILO. Some recommendations towards the ILO. The COVID-19 global call to action makes clear that the organization should play a leadership role with its constituents and in the international system in the recovery from COVID-19 and for the future sustainability of the sector. To do that, the ILO should strengthen its support of member states' efforts to create inclusive and sustainable economic growth, employment, and social development. increasing support for the development of policies and approaches that, first of all, generate employment-intensive investment, strengthen active labor market policies, promote an enabling environment for entrepreneurship and sustainable enterprises, boost productivity through diversification and innovation, harness the fullest potential of technological progress and digitalization, including platform work to create decent jobs and sustainable enterprises, promote skills development opportunities that are responsive to labor market needs. This can be done through a number of specific activities, such as collecting data, promoting access to good practices, and sharing knowledge on the social and economic impact of the pandemic and how to build back better. Elements to include in the data and good practices collection on how to build back better are, and I list a few, the potential of new technology and digitalization to increase or improve safety and health of workers and users, to improve services, to improve planning of services, to improve maintenance, to improve human resources management. Other elements are sustainable use of new technology, the potential of new green jobs, and because we are all human beings and we are either afraid or we resist change, it is also of the utmost importance that we collect good practice examples of management of change on these issues in the transport sector. ILO should also support tripartite constituents in building their capacity to create an enabling environment for enterprises and support activities aimed at generating employment. The office should also conduct studies aimed at analyzing current skills, workforce structure, and future needs of skills in the light of technological developments. Such studies should be the basis for ILO projects aimed at addressing skills imbalances. ILO could or should also conduct development projects to support decision makers plan and implement sustainable transport projects. A number of United Nations specialized agencies and other institutions, such as the World Bank, are already conducting projects to ensure the sector can maximize its potential in terms of green jobs and recovery. The ILO should come and complement these projects through its own experience. ILO should also incentivize governments to engage with private sector by demonstrating the added value and efficiency of private-public partnerships. And as recognized by Sustainable Development Goal 11.2, access to a safe and sustainable urban transport system for all is critical for better cities and improving road safety. The ILO should therefore strengthen collaboration with relevant international organizations, especially within the UN family, to this goal so it becomes a reality for all. And then last, ILO should also step up its own efforts and its support to member states in making sure that recommendation on the transition from informal to formal, that the efforts are increased and that a comprehensive approach towards this is taken, because it involves a lot of aspects, including building social protection floors, access to education, and also what we are discussing in this group, sustainable urban public transport systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. De Mister. Do we have anybody from the employers group that wishes to participate? I will now give the floor to Ms. Liam for the workers group. You have the floor.
Thank you. Before I go to some recommendations for social partners and governments to comment not on everything, but on just a few things that were presented by the employers, because I think there's area for agreement on consulting social partners on health and safety in relationship to COVID. Of course, we agree with social dialogue on health and safety measures, including through health and safety committees. Nonetheless, it is important that governments are able to and have the space to guarantee public health and services in times of crisis. We agree with the importance of investment in sustainable urban passenger transport services, and the importance of this being driven towards accessibility or directed towards accessibility and equal access for all. And so, again, we will reiterate the importance that the starting point for us is to talk about urban passenger transport as a right, as a basic right, as a public good in the sense that it has to be equally accessible to all, and that there are government responsibilities in this area. And then if that's the starting point, of course, we can also talk about enabling environments for sustainable businesses to the extent that they do not conflict with that goal of urban passenger transport. There may be a little bit more, but I may come back to this as I go through our recommendations. And I think that what does come through in the areas where we have agreement is that we recognize together, governments, employers, and workers, of the absolutely vital role that our sector must play in an inclusive and sustainable and resilient human-centered recovery from the crisis. So I'm glad that we're starting from the same place. We would include recommendations that the social partners work together to implement measures aimed at achieving modal shift away from private vehicle use to the use of public transport, including just transition and the promotion of decent work in urban passenger transport via well-funded, safe, and dynamic urban passenger transport services, which provide excellent quality of service. That social partners engage in cooperation and social dialogue, in particular collective bargaining, to achieve the following: healthy and safe work environments and services in the context of the pandemic, and implementation of the Violence and Harassment Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. Due diligence and chain of responsibility models to promote responsibility for standards and safety across the sector, including systems for introducing monitoring of services and decent work standards in tendering and service contracts, transparency in funding, cost models, and contractual relationships, transparency and fairness in the use of algorithms and workers' data, building on the 1997 ILO Code of Practice on workers' personal data, maximization of the positive impacts and mitigation of the negative impacts of unemployment of technological innovation. And so here also, of course, we are not opposing technological innovation, but we are stressing the importance of work consultation and collective bargaining with workers so that technology is driven, innovation happens in a way that supports sustainability, safety, and decent work, including full employment. Decent work and protections for workers in non-standard forms of employment in line with the Decent Work Agenda and Centenary Declaration, and the strengthening of women's employment in the sector through implementation of the recommendations outlined from the ITF UITP Positive Employers Gender Policy, and in line with Convention 168. For governments, again, recognizing urban passenger transport as a public good and a basic service, and access to passenger transport as a basic human right. In law and practice, of course, also supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, including 8, 11, and others. In line with Convention 122, support the improvement and expansion of urban passenger transport services and decent work as central to the recovery and climate response measures, in particular through ambitious modal share targets, i.e. use of public transport targets, public investment, and the development of sustainable funding models in consultation with unions and other stakeholders. An important part of this, of course, as I said before, involves solidarity between developed developed countries and developing countries to alleviate debt distress and expand fiscal space, enactment of policies, and exploring of the possibility of funding models for urban passenger transport that support modal shift, create good jobs and social solidarity, adoption of policies and standards for assessing the economic and social costs and benefits of PPPs, contracting out, insourcing, and support for public ownership and operations, again, recognizing the diversity of our sector. Ratify the Public Labor Clauses Convention 94 with implementation of Recommendation 84, and apply these along with due diligence and chain of responsibility instruments, including the UNGP's ILO Tripartite Declaration and OECD guidelines and multinational enterprises, and the guidelines on road safety and decent work in the transport sector to contracting chains in the urban passenger transport sector to create a chain of responsibility, including local governments, public transport authorities, operators, and subcontractors towards equal standards, fair pay, health and safety throughout the sector. Develop and implement policies and models for the protection of fundamental rights at work for workers in non-standard forms of employment, including independent and self-employed disguised employment, including through effective collective bargaining and social dialogue mechanisms in which all parties in relevant contracting chains and networks participate, adequate minimum pay standards based on principles of cost recovery, maximum limits on working and driving time, social protection, safety and health, again, in line with the decent work agenda and centenary declaration, and of course, the conclusions of the meeting of experts on non-standard forms of employment. Essentially enact and implement legislation and systems for combating misclassification in line with the Employment Relations Recommendation 198, including through tests based on the presumption of employee status, just to stress that given our recognition that workers in the platform economy or the, gig economy or in employed in platform urban passenger transport services are often those who are migrants, people of color, low income, recognizing that without these efforts to address misclassification, we are likely contributing to a model that is discriminatory, not only based on employment status, but also on race and immigration status. Enact and implement laws and policies for formalization and just transition for workers in informal UPT services in lines with Recommendation 204 and the ILO Just Transition Guidelines. Require and carry out labor and gender impact assessments on the impact of mass transit and formalization projects on workers and employment in both the formal and informal services, and include informal and formal workers and employers' representatives in planning and regulation and reform. And critically, again, thank you to the governments for continuing to bring this up, strengthening labor inspection and enforcement and access to remediation for violations, not only for formal passenger UPT services, but also for informal services. Finally, ratification and implementation of the Violence and Harassment Convention number 190 and implementation of Recommendation 206. Excuse me, it's not finally. Implementation of policies that target the root causes of gender discrimination and ensure women's right to paid work, safety and dignity and respect. For example, laws and regulations to ensure equal pay for work of equal value, protection from pregnancy discrimination, access to paid leave for caring responsibilities, the provision of decent sanitary facilities, and gender responsive work environments and recruitment and retention policies. And again, on technological innovation, monitoring the direct and indirect impact of technological innovation, including the use of big data, algorithms, and automation, AI. The monitoring the impact of privatization, contracting out, subcontracting, informalization, electrification and modernization on employment, working conditions, health and safety, gender equality in the sector, and enact legislation and policies to foster social dialogue and ameliorate negative impacts. Enact and implement legislation and policies on government control and ownership of data, including rights and responsibilities in relation to workers' data, and ensuring standards for quality control of digital systems in workplaces. If these are included, there is some ground for agreement, I think, with the position of the employers. So, and for the ILO, the office should design and implement development cooperation programs and projects to advance decent work and just transition, including measuring employment impacts of international public and private finance in UPT as part of recovery from the pandemic, work with the UN FCC Secretariat and other relevant UN bodies, international organization and member states on integrating decent work and just transition in sectoral measures on climate change, undertake research and disaggregated data collection to understand the characteristics, circumstances, and needs of informal workers in UPT services, including through further research on best practices concerning the implementation of the transition, the recommendation number 204 and the ILO guidelines I just transitioned in the context of urban UPT service is in order to, and as the basis for convening a tripartite meeting of experts to elaborate and adopt guidelines on the implementation of recommendation 204 and the just transition guidelines in the context of the sector, with the objective of promoting and measuring and realizing decent work in the sector overall. Support capacity development programs for employers and workers' organizations in the informal economy and in the formal economy where required to enable them to constructively engage in consultations and negotiations in the transition. Collect and share data and information on the extent of privatization, contracting out, subcontracting, remunicipalization, and insourcing in the sector, and their impact on decent work, employment, and sustainability. Collect and share data, information, and case studies related to the application of Convention 94, Recommendation 84, chain of responsibility, social conditions and tendering processes, and assess best practices within these frameworks, referencing the ILO guidelines on road transport and decent work in the, road safety and decent work in the road transport sector. Collect and share data on and information on the impact of technological innovation, privatization, contracting out, subcontracting, formalization, electrification, modernization on employment, working conditions, health and safety, gender equality in the sector, and promote social dialogue to address these issues. Promotion of the implementation of recommendation 198 in the context of the app-based ride-hailing and other app-based urban passenger transport services, again, with an eye towards equality based on Convention 111, and promotion of ratification of Convention 190 and the implementation of the associated recommendation in the context of urban passenger transport services. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Liam. Ms. Luna, the Vice Chairperson of the Government Group, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta. Sobre el punto de discusión número 3, las recomendaciones y aquello que el grupo de gobiernos de manera conjunta identificamos como acciones concretas que deberíamos hacer en el contexto de esta discusión y sobre todo para promover el trabajo decente y sostenible en el transporte urbano de pasajeros. Me parece que podría iniciar con un tema recurrente que hemos mencionado antes y que tiene muchas aristas, pero sin duda creo que entre las delegaciones participantes un tema en común es la expectativa, la recomendación o que sería ideal que la OIT y sus miembros en conjunto, gobiernos, empleadores y trabajadores de manera tripartita, delineen lineamientos para formalizar el trabajo, incluyendo en las plataformas digitales o lo que hemos venido llamando las el servicio en demanda a través de las plataformas digitales. Algunas delegaciones consideraron que era urgente o que es urgente que la OIT establezca lineamientos para tener claro el tema de la seguridad social para estos trabajadores, para los trabajadores en esta industria o en esta forma no tradicional de trabajo, ya que la gente que trabaja en las plataformas o a través de las plataformas ha quedado completamente desprotegidos en la pandemia y eso se exacerbó en la pandemia. Y estos lineamientos generales nos podrían ayudar para las regulaciones nacionales que cada país tenga en marcha o quiera poner en marcha. Algunos ejemplos es que la OIT tiene otras normas y lineamientos sobre salud y seguridad en el trabajo, pero no tiene lineamientos para formalizar este tipo de empleo. Algunos de los temas importantes que estos lineamientos idealmente deberían de abordar está la falta de coordinación entre los organismos para la planeación del transporte público, ya que es importante establecer una coordinación, por ejemplo, entre los ministerios de transporte u otros ministerios y otras autoridades relevantes en el tema. Escuchamos la buena práctica del gobierno, de algunos gobiernos sobre mesas de trabajo y de esta comunicación constante para atender todo lo relacionado con los transportes públicos, la profesionalización de los trabajadores en estas plataformas y la otorgación de licencias de conducir especializadas después de esta profesionalización. Y en general, me parece que si pudiéramos resumir de alguna forma lo que los gobiernos hemos estado discutiendo, es la necesidad de encontrar medidas para, además de mejorar el servicio, mejorar sobre todo las condiciones laborales de las personas que trabajan en la economía de las plataformas. Y esto está ligado de alguna manera con también un tema que ya mencioné anteriormente, que es la necesidad de una regulación adecuada y lo que implica. Me parece que varios de estos puntos fueron abordados por las recomendaciones muy concretas que hizo el portavoz del grupo de empleadores, acerca de lo que los gobiernos tenemos en nuestras manos hacer en términos de regulación. Y también lo mencionó la portavoz del grupo de trabajadores acerca de la inspección y otros temas, y eso es algo que tal vez aborde en mis puntos posteriores. Siguiendo en la línea de la formalización o cómo abordar los retos que enfrentan los trabajadores informales, un llamado de los gobiernos es a crear estrategias para abordar este problema y también o incluyendo las operaciones ilegales y la identificación de estas operaciones que no están formalizadas. Y reconocer de alguna manera a los profesionales que están en la informalidad para que tengan acceso a la protección social y a ser incluidos en general. De nuevo, nos parece que, o por lo menos una de las grandes conclusiones de nuestras discusiones esta mañana fue que cualquiera que sea estas guías o estos lineamientos que la OIT o que en nuestro conjunto elaboremos, tengan en cuenta que la prioridad es incluir a los trabajadores informales en la protección social en particular y en la protección de derechos también. Ya lo mencioné anteriormente, pero se repite aquí. Otra acción concreta es tomar medidas para identificar la vulnerabilidad de los trabajadores y también ya lo mencioné, la inspección laboral, que se priorice, y aquí hago énfasis en lo que mencionó el delegado de Brasil y que creo que ha sido un tema recurrente, es la profesionalización de los cuerpos de inspección laboral en los países, que tengan capacitación general, pero también en particular en temas de salud y seguridad en el trabajo, que tengan las competencias adecuadas para poder abordar los temas y los retos que ellos mismos identifican por su labor particular. De nuevo, lo dije antes, pero en este contexto es importante destacar que reiteradamente las delegaciones gubernamentales han insistido en la interlocución con los mandantes sociales, el diálogo social, para encontrar soluciones a todos los temas que hemos identificado, para promover leyes y políticas necesarias, para capacitación, para el tema de licencias, las horas de trabajo, las jornadas laborales y demás. Si no se encuentran soluciones tripartitas, será muy difícil atender todos estos retos. Reiteramos el tema de la violencia y cómo para reducir el impacto de la violencia, los gobiernos debemos evaluar los riesgos de la violencia urbana y basándonos en datos estadísticos y en análisis de datos duros para adecuar las legislaciones de seguridad pública con un enfoque de este sector y de la protección de los trabajadores en este sector. Algo que han mencionado, creo que también el grupo empleador lo mencionó y tiene relevancia también con la protección de los trabajadores, es los programas adecuados de mantenimiento para los vehículos, para que la inspección incluya aspectos de renovación y de tener al día los medios de transporte adecuados. Y esto va en línea con otros temas que hemos mencionado anteriormente. El tema de nuevo vuelve a la mesa, el tema de la inclusión es importante, la relación laboral y la legislación para la protección. Yo creo que en general un tema que ocupa y preocupa a los gobiernos de alguna otra manera es estos temas de protección, relación laboral, estándares, salarios y de qué manera vamos a insertar a todos los trabajadores formales e informales a una protección más amplia. Otro tema concreto que surgió es cómo la OIT tiene la capacidad, la oficina y los mandantes tal vez tienen la capacidad de proporcionar información concreta sobre los desafíos del futuro del trabajo en este sector para mejorar el rendimiento y las competencias. Un llamado decisivo de parte de las delegaciones a una mejor coordinación de la OIT con otras agencias de Naciones Unidas para seguir apoyando a los Estados miembros a avanzar en este tema y asegurar el trabajo decente y el trabajo y los servicios eficientes de transporte público. Y creo que también hay un tema transversal, sin duda, y se ha mencionado aquí en repetidas ocasiones, es que tienen que ser esta transición justa y también tomar en cuenta la transición ecológica y la transición de cambio climático. Capacitación creo que es un tema que también ya mencioné y si me permite, señora presidenta, estoy yendo sobre todas las notas. Como puede ver, fue una discusión sumamente activa y muy enriquecedora y muy rica de parte de las delegaciones. Están las buenas prácticas que ya mencioné anteriormente. Y si pudiera hacer un resumen de los puntos importantes, aparte de los que ya mencioné, también surgió esta idea de asegurar la continuidad en el servicio, la inversión sostenible para facilitar la formalidad y la transición, salud y seguridad en el trabajo, ya lo mencioné, el aprendizaje permanente. Y bueno, la manera en la que la OIT podría generar estos lineamientos o guidelines sobre el tema de las plataformas y la protección de los trabajadores podría ser a través de una reunión de expertos o cualquier otro medio tripartito en el que podamos discutir este tema. Y me parece que ahí me quedaría. Si hay algún otro tema, pediría a mis compañeros de grupo de gobiernos si quieren ahondar en más detalles sobre los elementos que mencioné. Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Ms. Luna. Do we have any representatives from any government? None? Okay, representative of Philippines, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I received a message from our capital to propose measures that may be considered by all of us as we navigate these issues before us right now. And I'm sorry, but I just got it, so I will still have to look for it. Here it is. The Philippines is proposing the promotion of technical cooperation and support from multilateral and development partners through grants and exchange programs for capacity building, particularly in data collection and monitoring and evaluation, labor inspection, gender mainstreaming in the urban transportation sector using available technologies and other means. Also in line with labor inspection, what may be considered is the participation of driving or the drivers and the employees in the labor inspection process. Another thing is the publication by the ILO of a compendium of cases, studies, statistics, policies, and best practices and actions adopted by member states that may be used as reference for planning and forecasting for decent and sustainable work environment. Another thing is support for the formation of SSEs among small industry players, and of course the usual technical and financial assistance from ILO is strongly appealed for. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the representative of the government of Philippines. I think we can go for a second round at the moment. Ms. Liam, do you have any response from the workers, or do you have any members that would like to intervene?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. One quick correction for the record. I had referred to the Workers with Family Responsibility Convention in my comments, and I had the wrong convention number. So it's not 168, it should be 156, if that can, thank you. And you all caught it, I can see. And now I would like to go to Biju Matthew, who is a delegate from the United States, to make some further comments.
Madam Chair and all the delegates, I wish to continue to emphasize and talk a little bit more about social protections and social protections for workers in two kinds of markets. Markets where mass scale informality persists, and labor markets in which disguised employment or misclassification persists. Starting with labor markets in which informality persists on a mass scale, workers there, we have to figure out robust mechanisms of bringing social protection there, because workers there are left out of contributory and non-contributory arrangements. There are very few contributory arrangements, and there is also a severe lack of non-contributory arrangements there. Therefore, we support and we advocate for the development and promotion of both horizontal and vertical arrangements as set forth in recommendations 202 and also reflected in recommendation 204. for these developments. There are good examples out there, such as the Monetax arrangement in Argentina and Mexico, and the cash transfers in Brazil and Mexico. So there are good examples out there, and we just need to make a commitment to extending these in other spaces where informal labor markets exist on a mass scale. Now coming to the second kind of labor market, the one where disguised employment and or what we call misclassification persists, there is a need to, of course, think about how to move workers into more and more formal arrangements. But as an interim, there is a need to develop social protection there, such as, for instance, in the case that's just happening in India, where there's a new Social Security Act and gig workers are being brought into the Social Security Act. As a matter of fact, just 5 days ago, we've had the portal for gig workers to register in that arrangement just opened up just 5 days ago. But of course, the question persists: where are the resources going to come from for the benefits that these workers are supposed to receive once they have registered through this portal? That question of resources is still up in the air, and that's where we need commitment from all parties in this process. Beyond, when it comes to the question of resources, even when everything is well laid out, we have seen consistent failure for the protection of gig workers and platform workers. I'll give you a very good example through the pandemic in New York State, where we had won an absolutely final court ruling on unemployment insurance for TNC drivers. We found that once the pandemic began, that was not being implemented, and instead workers were being turned towards federal unemployment protection, where the state unemployment insurance would give them a lot more protection. And it took the workers group to go back to court to get that implemented, and 68,000 workers received the full benefits after the workers group went back to court in spite of a final court ruling that existed from 2018 onwards. From 2018 onwards, there had been no payments from the companies into the unemployment insurance fund, and the government had not bothered to implement it. So I think we need to be very clear that technology and technology-based platforms exist and that workers are adopting them, they're embracing them, so there is very little resistance to it. But the failures are all around it in the kinds of practices we have where we give up or we sabotage social protection also at times. So it's important to put our commitments in that perspective and recommit ourselves into this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews from the US. Ms. Liam, is there any other interventions?
No more further interventions at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Demester, do you have any comments, or is there anybody who wants to intervene?
Yes, thank you. A very short couple of comments. First of all, to my government colleague spokesperson. Just mentioning that there is a meeting of experts foreseen on the platform economy in 2022. We are not gonna take any discussion in advance of that expert meeting on the platform or gig economy. Then on other instruments that are mentioned in this room, Convention 94, Recommendation 84, Recommendation 189, etc., etc. This is a sector meeting. The instruments are there. You have to pick up the discussion with your governments at member state level to ensure ratification. And I know in some countries like the US, ratification is not even a discussion, but implementation is. So these are instruments that are out there. We are not going to restart discussing them. We are not going to do cherry picking or partial referencing them. The instruments are there. you have to work with your local governments to make sure they are properly implemented, including the role of social partners in the implementation, supervision, etc. Social protection, interesting that you mentioned, but those who are more active in other meetings in this house would know that we just had a recurrent discussion committee on the strategic objective of social protection in June this year. So actually just a couple of months ago. And we're not going to restart the discussion. There is a whole report out there. You can all read and find it, and you have to build from there and not bring that or feed that into this sectoral meeting discussion. And as a final comment, because I think we will be able to conclude on point 3 today, and we are all talking a lot about decent work and decent working conditions. And I know that even the moment that we finish this meeting as a group, and those people who are following with digital links, that maybe our work for today is over, but that there are other people there, the level of the office whose work is not over, because they will have to start working on input for our further discussions in the working group. So I would wish them a lot of courage and also inspiration, because it will be your difficult task ahead to distill from all of these points that were mentioned by the groups. You will have to distill the elements that we have in common. So I wish you a lot of courage and good luck. And I hope that sometimes we were not too confusing in what we were proposing or suggesting, and that you will be able to, but I'm sure you can, you have the competency, the capacity, and the right people to feed us with the elements that we share, so that we can work towards conclusions tomorrow. So good luck.
Thank you, Mr. De Mester. Ms. Luna, do you have any comments to add?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Very quickly, I would say, since there were specific references to the comments that we made, in particular about this notion of the ILO producing guidelines for the formalization of especially the gig economy or the platform economy. I'm totally aware that there's a meeting coming up, and it's a meeting that gathered a lot of support from the government's bench. I was there in the discussion, so we're really looking forward for the meeting in 2022. Having said that, in this meeting, we are talking a very specific part of that gig economy, and it's the platform economies. And I think I would just want to repeat, if I can find my notes, I want to repeat something that that was brought very strongly among the governments in this meeting, at least in our exchange as a government group. And that is the fact that we are well aware that probably in this technical meeting, we won't be in a position to solve all the challenges of this new form of employment, or this non-standard form of employment, I think is the correct terminology from the COVID response outcome that we adopted in June this year. But at least there's a recognition that one way or the other, we would have to include these workers that work in the platform economies. They should be included somehow. How we do it, probably, I agree, probably we won't be able to find all the solutions, but at least something that came very, very clear from the government's bench was the fact that they need some sort of social protection. And even though we had that discussion in the ILC, and I was also involved in that one, I would say that I think the call from the governments is to take into account that, especially after the pandemic, it was quite obvious that there was a need to talk about this, and governments participating in these technical meetings meeting at least open to discuss this. And there were also very good examples exchanged in this meeting regarding how certain countries are already dealing with this, how they're giving licenses and all sorts of different ways of trying to regulate or to respond to this new way of working. So I think everything goes hand in hand. I will say that as long as this meeting can refer on these ideas of wanting and having to include these workers because they are working in this sector, it will be good. And of course, we'll be looking forward for the meeting in 2022 on the platform economies. That I guess, and I hope it's going to be broader than the urban transport. But I think it is important to flag these two things. And I felt compelled to do it because there are two of the main issues that have been raised by my colleagues in my government's group in our meeting. So I wanted to leave it at that. And then, yeah, I think that's it for the moment. And of course, if my colleagues want to elaborate on this, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Luna. Do we have anybody from the government sector? Brazil. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you once again. Just quickly, remarks here. We have heard, especially from the workers and from the employers, many suggestions involving governments, the role of the governments, and suggestions related to as to what governments should do. And there were a lot of suggestions in that sense. So governments have a hard time ahead trying to solve all the problems. We are aware of all the responsibilities, and that governments, they have this capacity and these responsibilities in order to try to deliver and offer a better environment in general regarding UTP services. But I would like to emphasize that governments won't, many of those suggestions that have been made, governments won't be able to do them alone. So when we are, we won't have time to do it right now to go over each of the suggestions that have been made, but when we have the opportunity to sit and discuss the final document and etc., we should try to include the social partners and all the parties of the chain of the economic chain of the urban transport services, to help and aid governments in reaching solutions and strategies adequate to solve the problems. That those problems are not only government problems; they are problems of all the whole society, involve the whole society. So we also heard many people talking about social dialogue, so governments will need this aid and this social dialogue now when facing all those challenges that are ahead of all of us. So when we are discussing those points, those suggestions, I guess that's something that we are going to have to work out. Also, perhaps as a solution or as a resource when putting down all those suggestions, we could use more some expression that I have heard a lot here from the ILO and other meetings. That is to include observations to the extent when we are suggesting something to some party, do it making an observation that it's only possible to the extent it is within their responsibilities. So I guess when we are going to put down and formally producing the final document of this meeting, we must pay attention to that, to the extension of the responsibilities of each party involved. and as possible involve every party in the discussions and in coming up with the solutions. Just a moment, please. I'd like to suggest one item for point of discussion 3. That is as follows. In order to fight widespread informality, especially when it comes to the urban passenger transport, regulation of the transport systems by authorities is urgent, mainly by implementing systems of operation permits and authorizations to be issued to those operators that prove full compliance to regulations. Regulations should also aim vehicle registration methods as well as periodic safety and mechanical inspections with strict enforcement of the provisions of law. Inspections should be carried out on undertakings and on the streets where informal operators can be easily spotted due to the fact that routes and embarking and disembarking sites are usually predefined. As in regards to non-standard forms of employment and platform digital based transport services, we understand that governments and social partners should study strategies on how to identify vulnerabilities of these workers on non-standard forms of employment, as well as policies engineered to preserve their rights by including them in comprehensive social protection systems and preventing precarization and the misuse of this particular workforce in ways that undermine their fundamental rights at work. Just to reinforce and stress what our vice chairperson has already mentioned. We understand that the appropriate funding should be allocated to the enforcement of legislation applicable to the urban passenger transport sector. In line with labor inspection recommendation number 82, governments should apply to transport undertakings and outside them appropriate systems of labor inspection to ensure that enforcement of legal provisions relating to conditions of work and the protection of workers while engaged in their work. When subcontracting urban passenger transport services to private operators, if is the case, authorities should design financial balanced, comprehensive, and legally based contracts to regulate the operation, avoiding assuming unnecessary risks in subcontracting, and establishing all duties and obligations, including those related to the workforce and their rights. Those contracts should include items referring to cost recovery, fair policies, labor standards, and occupational safety and health, by establishing vehicle patterns that respect the highest ergonomic standards in order to preserve workers' health and safety by setting adequate seats and equipment configurations, as well as reducing noise levels, vibration, heat, emissions, and radiation. Government and social partners should promote, implement, and enforce laws, regulation, and policies to the extent it is within their responsibilities with regard to standardizing training and licensing procedures, as well as fatigue, working time, driving times, and break periods. It's important to refer to that because not necessarily governments or local authorities or state or federal authorities are directly responsible for training the workforce. In many cases, the companies will have to do it, the private sector will have to do it. So it's important that there is some kind of agreement among all involved when we are talking about training and licensing procedures and etc. So about urban violence, our vice chairperson has already mentioned that urban violence is an issue that should be addressed as well, and included in safety policies strategies, local safety policies strategies, aiming to protect the workers in the UPT services, protect from acts of violence, of urban violence. Governments should implement regulations and enforcement regarding periodic repair and documented maintenance programs of vehicles in general, mobilizing domestic and international resources to implement fleet renewal programs, including those with public guarantee programs to increase their accessibility to self-employed independent workers. So self-employed and independent workers should also be considered when it comes to improving the quality of the vehicles that are used. Regarding welfare facilities play an essential role in ensuring transport worker wellness and decent working conditions. These facilities include bathroom, washing, and other sanitary and comfort facilities. The lack of such facilities can have negative consequences for all transport workers, including and especially women. Ensuring sufficient welfare facilities should be an integral part of the development and updating of urban passenger transport infrastructures. Governments and employers should be involved in implementing those structures. Governments should consider enacting comprehensive social security policy and legislation that combines contributory and non-contributory mechanisms in order to include within their coverage all urban passenger transport workers, including non-wage earning and small-scale professionals, as well as extending social security to informal workers. According to the conclusions of the meeting of experts on non-standard forms of employment, countries should aim to design and adapt their social security systems so as to provide workers in non-standard forms of employment with conditions equivalent to workers in standard employment. Access to healthcare system and benefit from income security in case of sickness, maternity, unemployment, employment injuries, and occupational disease, invalidity, and old age, as well as protection for their dependent family members in case of death, should also be considered. As for wages and remuneration, I'm not going to say anything now. We have something to suggest, but we can leave it for tomorrow. Thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry for taking so long to express my points of view. And just to stress that I'm only reinforcing what has already been very well put and said by our vice chairperson. So thank you.
Thank you to the government representative of Brazil. I believe the workers group have an intervention.
Just a few, I know we're almost out of time, so just a few comments in relationship to what the governments and employers have put for us. First, thank you to the governments thank you for the governments and for both putting forward specific text. I can't comment exactly on the text, although much of the spirit of what you've said we're in agreement with, and of course, the importance of continuing the discussion about protecting the fundamental rights and principles at work and decent work for in line with the Centenary Declaration for workers in non-standard forms of employment, including the gig economy. I just wanted to take an opportunity before I go there. Also thank you to the employer's vice chairperson for recognizing that Convention 94 Recommendation 84 are out there and available to us. I believe that the role of this meeting is to draw on the instruments that have already been agreed by the tripartite partners, to make them, to specify them, and talk about how they can be applied to our sector. So I think that's what we're doing again with the discussion at the ILC on social protection. I think our comments are very much about how that discussion can be taken forward within the context of urban passenger transport services. So I hope that the conclusions can reflect this. Lastly, I just wanted to reiterate the essential character, the vital character of the two we have put before you. The first one talks about the inclusive formalization of informal services and integration into mass public transport or mass transit systems. We're talking about widespread informality in developing countries and cities, such as 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles. I don't need to go into the mentions of types of services, but the recommendations in this resolution, and which is why we've separated it as a resolution, is for the development of guidelines that will bring together recommendation 204 and the Just Transition Guidelines for an inclusive transition from informal services in a widespread context to formality with sustainable enterprises. And the second resolution, and I think that we have come to agreement on this, is about stressing the vital nature of our sector in sustainable recovery and addressing climate change, and how we can work together to do that, including through support from governments, but also the ILO, and in cooperation with UNFCCC and other UN bodies. And this is about this moment, which for us is a unique moment because of the pandemic and because of the climate disaster that's before us. And I think we would show an amazing feat of tripartitism and cooperation by passing this, because it is about our sector and all of us within the sector, governments, employers, and workers. And so I would urge each of the counterpart groups to consider these favorably. The last point, and I bring from the delegate from Brazil, mentioned how many of the responsibilities that we talk about today are, of course, joint responsibilities. And we have talked about urban passenger transport contracting chains, where we have chains starting with sometimes central governments through local government, public transport authorities, and operators, subcontractors. So social partners, governments, and all parties in these contracting chains have joint responsibilities to the extent of their abilities for the sustainability and health and decent work in our sector. And we agree to that. And I just want to end by saying that when we talk about worker and the involvement of unions in discussions on formalization, on appropriate application of technological innovation, on health and safety, around sustainable funding models, cost recovery, what we're talking about is workers and unions that are recognizing that this moment requires us to participate in a responsible way in our sector to make it more responsible. And we're making that commitment to all of you. And so I think reflecting those joint responsibilities in the conclusions will be important and adequate to the crisis that we face right now.
Thank you, Ms. Liam. Mr. Demester, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. First, to our government colleague from Brazil. I know we talked a lot about what governments should or could do, but like my colleague from the workers' bench just said, we immediately after that added that we seek for a collaborative approach, shared ownership. So this is not about extending responsibilities, it's about the responsibility and seeking for joint solutions, a partnership approach, shared ownership. Then the other elements he mentioned, well, we're not in drafting yet. And as I said, it is now up to the office to distill from the discussion the elements that we have in common, the elements that we share. And maybe I was not clear enough when I made reference to some of the conventions and recommendations, but they are now out there. They address member states. We are not going to do cherry picking. We are not going to do partial referencing. We are not going to discuss them. You either discuss them, implement and ratify at member state level or at the level of the International Labour Conference. So for us, we will not accept any reference to those in any conclusion because we simply do not support them, some of them. Others we do support, but as I said, this is not the place to do cherry picking or partially pick elements from them. On social security, I think we can find inspiration, we can find common ground. For example, on the, as I mentioned already, the 2021 resolution on social protection from the Committee on the Strategic Objective of Social Protection, there is some general wording that I think we can use or live with. And then final comment, non-standard forms of employment, that is no longer the terminology we use in this house. It is diverse forms of employment. And in the document, the response to the crisis, there is no mention whatsoever of non-standard and not even of diverse forms of employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have a government.
Yes.
We have the representative of the government of Iraq. You have the floor.
لدي بعض الملاحظات للتحول إلى وسائل أكثر استدامة. أولاً من الملاحظات تحسين خدمة النقل العام، وأقصد بخدمة النقل العام خدمة عالية الجودة بتكلفة ميسورة عبر وضع سياسات محددة. اثنين، انتهاز سياسات تقلل الوفيات في النقل من حوادث عن طريق وضع ضوابط أكثر صرامة للسرعة، للتراخيص، للسياقة، اشتراط التأمين، توسيع فكرة دور المرأة في النقل المستدام وإدراك حاجات النقل للفئات ذات الدخل المحدود أو المنخفض والنساء والأطفال وكبار السن وذوي الإعاقة، وحلها من أجل المساواة وتوفير نقل مستدام وخدمة مع توفير الرعاية المطلوبة أو الضمان بعد هذه الحوادث. تشجيع تعميم المعلومات والبيانات النوعية للنقل على نساع واسع جدا بين جميع الدول، وتبادل المعلومات بين الدول العربية والدول الغربية. إقامة مؤسسات متخصصة يجري تمويلها للتعامل، وأقصد بها مؤسسات خاصة وليست تابعة للحكومات، مع سياسات النقل المستدام في أنشطة البحث والتطوير وتقدير الإدارة. وشكرا. بعض الملاحظات.
Thank you to the government representative of Iraq. Do we have any other? With this, we have concluded our discussions to point 3. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your rich and lively debate. We will have to stop here as we have concluded all the discussions. But before closing, I would like to give the floor to the Secretariat for announcements.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. As we have concluded the discussion on point 3, there will be no plenary sessions tomorrow. You will go directly into your group meetings. The office, based on the deliberations of the past 2 days, will prepare the draft conclusions and recommendations for future action for consideration by your respective group meetings tomorrow afternoon. In order to facilitate the review of the draft document in your group meetings on Thursday morning, the day after tomorrow, alongside the comments of other groups, we kindly request you to submit your proposed amendments to the office, to the draft interact to the Secretariat by 6 tomorrow. Secretariat will overnight consolidate the position of the 3 groups and present a revised version with proposed amendments in comment boxes for your review in group meetings on Thursday before and subsequently at the Working Party on conclusions. As we are on the topic of the Working Party on conclusions, please allow me to announce the name of those nominated by their respective groups. From the government, we have the Government Vice Chairperson, Ms. Sara Luna, Mr. Bernardo Enrique Velasco from the Government of Brazil, Mr. Enrique Perez Mendoza from the Government of Chile, and Ms. Carla Messina from the Government of Italy. and along with their 4 advisors. The employers have nominated Mr. Christy Meister, the employer vice chairperson, Mr. Joe Kenny, Mr. Ian McDonald, and Mr. Martiza Hernandez Castaneda. From the secretariat, we will have Mr. Matias Espinosa. From the workers, we have Ms. Ulsan Liam, who is the worker vice chairperson, Mr. John Mark Mawanika, Mr. Manuel Cortez, and Ms. Mirabal. From the workers secretariat, we will have Ms. Maite Llanos, Ms. Daria Quebrario, and Mr. Ruan Subhasinghe. Thank you.
Ms. Luna, you have any comments?
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Es un comentario y una información adicional a los nombres que mencionó la oficina. Agregaría a la delegación de Filipinas la señora Cheryl Daitek como asesora en nuestro grupo. Y además, aprovechando que tengo el uso de la palabra, preguntar a la oficina si sería posible que el documento consolidado que circule en el jueves en la tarde, entiendo, pueda ser en lugar de que los comentarios de los 3 grupos sean reflejados en ese documento en lugar de como comentarios en control de cambios, track changes. Eso en mi experiencia coordinando la posición de grupos se nos facilita mucho más y más en el formato virtual poder proyectar en pantalla un texto con control de cambios más que con bubbles, con los como tipo comentarios se hace más difícil entender exactamente, sobre todo si son propuestas literales o propuestas de lenguaje, es mucho más sencillo para nosotros que sea en control de cambios. Espero que esto pueda hacerse. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. Luna. We will take that into consideration. I wish you all a very good evening, and the meeting is now adjourned.